Hey, sixth grade. This morning I'm going to talk to you guys about the ancient dynasties of China. We've already talked about the Shang dynasty, and now we're into the Zhou dynasty. And you guys have, done your assignments in the book and the readings. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of that stuff, including the mandate of heaven, and then something that the book doesn't cover, which is dynastic cycles, which is something I usually cover in the classroom. So I'm going to take this opportunity and go over some of that. Um, and then obviously when you guys have questions, please leave them. If you do have questions, leave them in the comment area, or you guys can, ask me questions during our Zoom check-in meetings. But yeah, let's start talking about some of the ancient dynasties of China. So we were talking about the Shang dynasty for a while. We said it was the first dynasty established in China, but we also said that it wasn't going to be, the only dynasty. Just like we saw in empires in Mesopotamia um, and throughout Egypt, and it's not going to be the only empire to exist in these areas, especially Mesopotamia. We saw a number of empires move in and sort of take over for the previous ones. And that's kind of what's going to happen in China for a very long, long time. Dynasties are families of rulers. When a ruler uh, dies, then his authority and his ability to rule usually passes to the eldest son or somebody within the family. That's how dynasties are established. So the ruling actually, stays within one family during this time. And but there's not going to be just one dynasty or one family that rules over China throughout history. There's going to be many. So the Shang was the first dynasty, okay, and then the Zhou came in, and they took over the Shang, okay. But I'm just going to kind of go through its history and explain, how they were able to do this, how they were able to establish their authority, and then how this sort of established what was known as the dynastic cycle. So, a long time ago in ancient China, the Zhou family, they wanted to rule China. The Shang had ruled for hundreds of years at this point. Nobody remember how the Shang took power, but the Shang family had been in power for a very long time. And the Zhou family, they tried to overthrow the Shang kings for a while, but they always found themselves unsuccessful. Still, they kept trying, and war continued. And hoping to end the battles and finally win, the Zhou knew that they needed the powerful nobles on their side. Nobles were, some of the wealthy families who owned and controlled a lot of the land and had many soldiers at their command. They knew that they needed to get these people on their side. And the nobles at this point were torn between the Shang and the Zhou. They didn't know who to back. The Shang at this point, they had become very selfish, over the centuries that they had ruled. But the nobles did not want to support a losing side. So the Zhou decided that they actually came up with a pretty clever idea. So they told the nobles that the gods had decided that the Zhou had the right to rule. Okay, the Zhou called this the mandate of heaven. So the Zhou explained that the gods had said that they would only let the Zhou rule as long as they were good rulers. If they became selfish like the Shang kings and thought of themselves first, then the gods would appoint a new ruler. So this sort of set up, a justification system that allowed, not just the Zhou, but new rulers who came in, the authority to rule. They said, the gods have given me that authority, and people believed them. So this tells us, a couple things. That the Chinese, these ancient Chinese dynasties, they were polytheistic. They believed in the existence of many gods. And that, they believed that these gods had the ultimate authority within, their reality. And so whoever the gods had backed, then, they must be right. They must be the right person for the job. So, the nobles, whether or not they believed this, who's to say, but they were tired of the constant fighting that broke out between the Shang and the Zhou. So most of the nobles knew life would continue pretty much the same under either ruler, whoever has the mandate of heaven. What was, important to them was the stop of the warring. Okay, so the mandate of heaven actually sounded like a good idea. So as I said, the mandate of heaven created a justification system. The mandate either said or implied three major things. The right to rule is granted by the gods. This gave the ruler sort of religious power over the people. The right to rule, number two, the right to rule is only granted if the ruler cares about his people more than he cares about himself. So this gave the ruler, secular power, power over the people, and the right to decide what is good for the people, because the ruler must care about the people, or the gods would remove him as a ruler. So it's a system based on rules, and these leaders would have to follow these rules. Number three, the right to rule is not limited to only one dynasty or family. A dynasty can replace. This justified rebellion. So when a new leader leads a successful rebellion, he must sort of have the support of the gods, or he would not be allowed to rule, because it was the gods who chose the rulers. The nobles agreed that it was true that the Shang had become selfish. Perhaps the Zhou would be a better choice, so they joined the Zhou in rebellion, and the Shang were deposed. No longer kings, they were tossed out. So the rebellion was successful, and the Zhou obviously had the right to rule. It was a clever sort of propaganda campaign, and it worked. It convinced a lot of people that the gods had chosen these people, and therefore we must follow them because the gods obviously have their backs, and so it sort of became this whole thing. Um, but the nobles in the beginning, they were pretty much right. Nothing much changed under the Zhou for hundreds of years during their rule. Not for the nobles and not for the peasants, but the warring did stop. And as you can see on the map here, okay, so the Shang dynasty has ended. The Zhou dynasty replaces it. And as you can see, the map has grown a little bit bigger under the Zhou dynasty, so they're able to expand upon their borders a little bit more. But the important thing is they've taken over the lands of the Shang, all right, and now we see a new dynasty taking shape. But as we're going to see, it's not going to be just one or two dynasties. We're going to see multiple ones start popping up here in a little bit. Okay, so going back to what I said at the beginning, there's sort of like a pattern established with all of these dynasties. One begins and then ends, and then another begins, and there's actually sort of a step-by-step, pattern that appeared with all of these dynasties throughout Chinese history. And this was known as the dynastic cycle. Okay, so here you could see sort of 6 steps in the cycle that begins. So I'm just going to walk you through it a little bit here, and then we'll kind of break it down. So starting at the top, number 1, mandate of heaven. The people believes the new dynasty has the God's approval. So a new dynasty has taken shape, and they have the mandate of heaven. So people believe that they have the backing of the gods. All right. Then years and years and years pass. The dynasty's power grows weaker. They may have turned their backs on the people. They have become corrupt during this time. And the people are starting to question whether or not they have that mandate of heaven. And then number 3, a disaster happens. Some sort of natural disaster like a flood or a famine. Nothing really that the dynasties or the people in charge, they have power over, the control over. But something happens that sort of, shakes the faith of the people. They start to question even further, do these people have the backing of the gods? Number 4, people believe the dynasty has lost God's approval. So all of this has happened. They become corrupt. Famine has occurred. So obviously maybe the gods are upset with the people in charge or the people of China. So people believe, well, it must be the problem with the people in charge. Those kings must not have the mandate of heaven because these bad things are happening to us. So we need to get them out of here. We need to overthrow them. That's number 5. A rebellion takes place and the dynasty is overthrown, kicked out. And then number 6, a new dynasty takes its place. All right, so we saw the Shang, in charge for 100 years, and then the Zhou came in, threw them out, and they established their dynasty. All right, and this new dynasty begins, steps in, and restores peace and order. And then it begins again. And then that new dynasty goes through these multiple steps until a new dynasty takes their place, and then another one, and it just keeps going on and on and on, sort of like the life cycle you learned in science class. All right, so breaking down the dynastic cycle here, Again, something that repeated over and over and over throughout China's history. So number one, just going through the steps here, when a new family overthrew the old dynasty, took the mandate of heaven, all right, this was the beginning of the cycle. The dynasty ruled for sort of the first half of the cycle, and then they were good, gave land to the peasants, they cut down on taxes and corruption, and this lasted for a while. And then an emperor or king would come in and sort of be cut off from the people and the peasants of China. Corruption would start within the government, and there would be minor uprisings amongst the peasants, which would be put down. Land would be taken away from these peasants. Taxes would rise, become a burden on the people. All right, and the people are starting to really, be against the government, the emperor. Towards the end of the dynasty, as I said, there would be some sort of major natural disaster, a series of disasters, as I said, which the emperor would not or could not, control or address, and the people would be left on their own. And these natural disasters would lead people to believe that the king lost this mandate of heaven and no longer have the authority to rule in China. At this time, one of the nobles or rich families would start a major revolution, which would be supported by the people of China, and soon the old dynasty would be overthrown. And then, as we see, the cycle would start again with a new dynasty. All right. So this was, the pattern of the dynastic rule in China. It was repeated over and over throughout Chinese history, as we're going to see. So it's not just going to be the Shang dynasty or the Zhou dynasty, but we're also going to be looking at the Qin dynasty. We're looking at the Ming dynasty, and there are many much others that unfortunately we don't have the time to cover. But just to say that it's not just one or two, but many dynasties go through the same pattern throughout China's history. So we're going to be talking about that in the next section, actually, when we get to Chinese philosophies. We're going to be talking about an era in China's history called the Time of the Warring States, and during this time there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of violence and brutality, and people are unsure of their own safety, and it's just all these different dynasties and kings. They're now fighting each other constantly for control of China and land. And during this time, these Chinese philosophies start to sort of take shape in a way in which to, people start thinking about other ways in which to, demand authority over the people, or, to bring peace between dynasties and the governments. And but again, we'll talk about that next time, expand on this lesson a little bit when we start lesson 3 in our book, and that'll begin next week. All right, so I hope everybody's doing well, and again, if you guys have any questions or comments on the video, you can leave them in the Loom website, or you can make a comment